Welcome back to Dentro La Storia, the portal for those who love contemporary history. As promised in our special episode of Posta Dentro La Storia this month, and as promised some time ago, to all of you who follow us, here is our Christmas gift for 2025. We told you to send us your ideas for an alternate history, and some of you didn't just send ideas, but even very long, fully developed texts about alternate histories. Others instead simply threw out the idea of what could have happened, which is the basis of all alternate histories. We selected 2 of them. I'll tell you, we received 46, so these 2 are the best, at least the most intriguing ones, and the ones that inspired me the most out of all 46. I hope the other 44 who wrote in don't take it the wrong way, but this time we decided to select these alternate histories. I won't tell you who the authors of the messages are who sent these ideas. Those who did will definitely recognize themselves, but let's move on to the first of our alternate histories. What would have happened if Francoist Spain had accepted Nazi Germany's invitation to actively participate in World War II, not just with the Blue Division, the famous volunteers sent to the Soviet Union, but as a full-fledged participant, siding with the Axis, attacking the Allied forces? This is one scenario. Let's start from this assumption. At the end of the Spanish Civil War in 1939, the Iberian country was exhausted, with devastated countryside, cities partly in ruins, and a social fabric that had to be rebuilt from scratch, with many Republicans in exile abroad. The birth of a new regime, the Francoist regime. A regime made up of a dense network of personal loyalties, repression, but also the will to rebuild a nation in this situation. And with armed forces that emerged, severely tested, the Civil War. Think of the Air Force, but especially of the Spanish Armada, the Navy that had been halved in its strength by the Civil War. Only 2 battleships, the loss of one of the 2 heavy cruisers, and the need to ask fascist Italy for ships, mostly outdated, to bolster its own forces. It shows how Spain was not ready. But let's try to think. It's July 1940. France has fallen, has asked for peace. Germany dominates the continent, and Italy has just entered the war alongside Germany. At that moment, Hitler appears fully in control, and in fact, Mussolini agrees to give up his non-belligerence to enter the war, thinking it will be a quick war, an easy war. He's wrong. Franco, no, he doesn't accept. Since Spain is a devastated country, it needs rebuilding. And to make Hitler understand that he is not willing to accept, he sets extremely difficult conditions. If Mussolini had sent the famous molybdenum list, the list we've already talked about, French parish, territories in Africa, economic and military aid, and supplies with unacceptable conditions. But what would have happened if we started from something different? The Falange, Francisco Franco's political party, is pushing for an even more authoritarian turn, even further to the right. The more ideologically driven officers insist on a close alliance with the Axis, seeing it as the only chance for revenge against the Western democracies that had supported the Republic, even if not too heavily. They are viewed as the main enemy, along with the Soviet Union, which had indeed armed the Republic, sending weapons, tanks, planes, and military advisors. Hitler, galvanized by his success in France, agrees to support Madrid with an increasing flow of raw materials and territorial promises that are vague, but enough to convince Franco. Germany, in return, gets what it always wanted, the chance to contribute and access to the Strait of Gibraltar. The switch date then, the date when history changes, in this case, it's October 12, 1940, when Franco, according to this new timeline, appears on the balcony of the Royal Palace and announces that Spain is entering the conflict. What does this decision by Franco mean? The implementation of what is called Operation Felix, that is, the operation to invade Gibraltar by land, which is an almost impregnable stronghold. Above all, it is the crucial point for access to the Mediterranean from the Atlantic and for the exit from the Mediterranean toward the Atlantic. We know that this operation was never carried out. The The reason is simple. Franco never gave his consent, not only to an attack by Spanish forces, but not even to the passage or transit of German forces through Spanish territory. So, in our alternative timeline, from December 1940 to January 1941, a mixed Spanish-German corps of 6 divisions is formed and crosses the peninsula and goes to attack Gibraltar. The land defenses of Gibraltar are solid, but they can't receive constant supplies because the Royal Navy is engaged on too many fronts. On February 2nd, 1941, Gibraltar falls for the first time since 1704. It's news that shakes public opinion in London, but also in Washington, where people are watching the evolution of the European situation with growing concern. On the other hand, with Gibraltar in the hands of the Axis, England struggles to supply, Malta struggles to directly supply its own troops in Egypt, and has to face the journey around Africa via the Cape of Good Hope. The supply lines are tremendously stretched. Control of the strait affects the balance in North Africa. Not only does Spain, after taking Gibraltar, also deploy forces in Africa, ground forces sent to support Rommel's Panzer Army Africa. Even though poorly equipped, the Spanish Expeditionary Force gains experience in the field and can provide something more in terms of manpower that can be used on the battlefield. In the summer of 1941, with supplies coming through a more controlled Mediterranean, the Axis manages to push the British back to Alexandria, Egypt, and beyond El Alamein, and everything seems like it could change. The problem is that Spain, if it decides to enter the war, does so at a very high cost. The country doesn't have the industrial capacity to sustain a modern conflict. It didn't have this capacity even before the Civil War, let alone after. Food rationing becomes a big problem in the cities, bread lines get longer, and the black market thrives. Agricultural production decreases because there's less workforce, there are fewer resources available, and so the agricultural output suffers. And while on one hand the regime prodded by the clergy sees the war as a national duty, in the poorer areas of Spain discontent begins to be felt. Of course, the Falange can count on a tool of repression, a tool of control, the iron fist against discontent, against protests. But the risk of a new fracture is there. When Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, it's also part of the classic historical narrative. Franco decides to send a second contingent to the Eastern Front, and they are not just Falangist volunteers, as in our timeline, but a real expeditionary corps. Several sufficiently armed divisions that are mainly deployed in the northern area, the one of the siege of Leningrad. The Spaniards proved to be fanatical in all this, talking about a new crusade against the barbaric Bolsheviks, the godless ones. But when our picture changes again and returns to the classic scenario, that is, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the entry of the United States into the war, it is clear that America itself considers Spain a direct ally of Nazism, and therefore a potential strategic target. The first measures are economic in nature. The United States imposes a total embargo on oil and agricultural products, which causes a collapse of the Spanish agri-food system. From that moment on, Spain depends indirectly on Germany for everything concerning the people's food supply, and we are close to collapse. In 1942, Alexandria in Egypt is still there, in British hands. With American aid, the British counterattack, and the Italian-German lines give way. And, just like in our classic timeline, Rommel is forced to retreat. While thousands of Spaniards remain trapped in the sands of Libya, only a few units manage to re-embark for Almeria. And with Operation Torch, that is, the Anglo-American landing in the Maghreb, the Allies, in addition to liberating Casablanca and Oran with the surrender of the French forces, can aim directly at Gibraltar. With Africa lost, the Allies no longer aim at Italy, but at Spain. It becomes the soft underbelly of the Axis. Spain is isolated, poor, and weak. On July 9, 1943, meanwhile, in Sicily, there is Operation Ashy, which in our timeline is something smaller, mainly done to distract the Axis forces. In the Mediterranean theater, a second large amphibious force lands near Huelva and Cadiz. The Americans, unlike the Italians, do not see the Spanish as an enemy people. They make promises of reconstruction and democratization. Spanish garrisons, especially phalangists, resist, but morale is extremely low. The Wehrmacht sends reinforcements through France, but these reinforcements struggle to arrive because the logistics are complicated, bridges are bombed, railway lines are sabotaged by the Maquis, and the flow of reinforcements is very slow. By October 1943, the Allies control Andalusia and are advancing more and more towards Madrid, which is being evacuated. Franco's government returns to Burgos during the Civil War. Franco's mistake is wanting to resist until the end. In February 1944, as Americans neared Toledo and the British advanced along the coast, Spain is an exhausted country. Cities bombed, countryside abandoned, fuel reserves now depleted. The population rises up, especially in Asturias and the Basque Country, where many former Republicans had sought refuge and which were historically opposed to Francoism. In our alternate timeline, a coup in Burgos overthrows Franco, and part of the army negotiates surrender with the Allies for an immediate end to hostilities. Franco is arrested and given to the Americans, dying in a Nuremberg prison during war crimes investigations. Spain, in 1945, is no longer an isolated dictatorship-ruled, devastated country, but is transitioning toward a parliamentary republic. Western liberal democracy models. Italy, by contrast, gets less attention and fewer Allied resources, as the Mediterranean's main front has moved to the Iberian Peninsula. This allows the Germans to maintain a stronger and longer-lasting resistance along the Gothic line, prolonging the war in Italy by several months compared to our actual timeline. Gibraltar becomes British again, Free France gets back Morocco, and most of the territories temporarily occupied by Axis troops in Europe. The Spanish intervention changes several aspects, and above all, it's a boomerang, because it opens a second Allied landing front that indirectly accelerates the fall of Germany. Germany is forced to fight on too many fronts and to deplete its natural resources even more quickly. The war still ends in May 1945, but the political map looks very different. Spain is a young democratic republic under Allied supervision. Repeated invasions turn the Western Mediterranean into a post-war reconstruction laboratory. And Italy is Italy. If it is not liberated by the Anglo-Americans in agreement with the partisans, then it could become prey to the Red Army advancing from the east and become a satellite of Moscow itself, or a battleground between different political factions, with a much stronger communist party due to the long-armed resistance. This is one of the two timelines we studied before moving on to the next one. Let's move on to our second alternate history, one that takes us to Southeast Asia. What would have happened if the fall of Saigon had triggered the collapse of the so-called domino effect? It causes a historic change within Western democracies, who witnessed the first defeat of the United States in their history. Even in the United States, defeat in Vietnam hurts because it challenges the entire American model. But what if the United States had won the Vietnam War? Nam, did you ask us that? And we have developed an alternate history. Our alternate history begins in October 1972, when American forces consistently support the Army of the Republic of South Vietnam. With a counteroffensive that we have called Liberty Storm, they strike a fatal blow to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The supply route, which passes through Laos and Cambodia, brings ammunition, weapons, provisions, and fresh troops to the south to directly strike the territory where the Americans are also fighting. The trail, systematically bombed with new satellite reconnaissance techniques, is paralyzed. In addition, the South Vietnamese forces cross the border and begin to invade the north. The practical result is that we are at our limit. He accepts an unconditional ceasefire, and he signs an agreement that de facto establishes the reunification of Vietnam under a pro-Western government, politically and militarily supported by the United States. What does this alternative scenario cause? Let's look at it in America. 1973. The victory in Vietnam flips the national mood like an omelet. In this timeline, the Watergate scandal takes on much more limited, restricted proportions. Nixon, strengthened by the enormous political capital gained from the Asian success, manages to contain the criticism from public opinion. And he presents the scandal as an attempt by his enemies to diminish America's greatest victory since the end of World War II. Congress, stunned by this triumph, grants him a much wider margin of maneuver. The Republican Party, galvanized, rallies around the idea of an America leading the free world. The isolationist wing of the party remains marginal. The neoconservatives emerge ahead of their time, almost 30 years before the presidency of Bush Jr., finding in a pacified Vietnam the ideal laboratory for their doctrine of assisted democratization, or rather forced democratization. And in Moscow, the American victory in Vietnam creates a deep crack in that image of strategic infallibility that the Soviet Union had maintained since 1945. For us, it was a symbol. The possibility of the Eastern world supporting anti-imperialist revolutions had already been seen elsewhere, but this time it is resounding. The fall of the communist capital, which falls into the hands of the South Vietnamese and Americans, generates doubts among Marxist movements around the world. The student protests in the West, which in our reality draw new energy from Vietnamese resilience, but it fades here. Brezhnev, worried, accelerates military modernization programs, increasing the pressure on an economy that is already fragile. The Soviet leadership at that time understands that the reinvigorated American strength could attract new allies to the Western camp, new partners. For example, China, already distrustful of Moscow, broke off relations with the Soviet Union some time ago and is now increasing ties with Washington. 3 years before our 1979 China, then defeated by North Vietnam, in this alternative timeline, sees Beijing interpreting the events as a clear signal. American power in the United States and Asia is direct. A now ill Mao orders his diplomats to speed up talks with Washington, and Kissinger takes advantage of the opportunity to create an even more advantageous triangulation. The United States directly and indirectly influences the initial internal debates on economic reforms. Not a complete opening, to be clear, but the anti-Soviet ideological pressure leads post-Maoist China to seek a faster path toward modernity. And what is happening in Southeast Asia? The victory in Vietnam turns Vietnam into almost a satellite of the United States. They invest in infrastructure, education, and light industry, making Vietnam a manufacturing hub for the United States. Not just him. Thailand, already pro-American, becomes a logistics and commercial hub. Indonesia, which had been a leader of the Third World Movement, moves even closer to Washington, while still maintaining its strategic independence. The Philippines, where the American presence has always been very strong since the Spanish-American War, at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, decide to host regional conferences. Named Asian Liberal, a model that actually doesn't exist. And in Europe, what does this alternative line of an American victory in Vietnam mean? France and West Germany, while keeping diplomatic autonomy, approached the Soviet Union more cautiously. Brandt, the Chancellor, continues his Ostpolitik, but its foundations are less optimistic. The revitalized NATO achieves a general increase in military spending. The common perception in this context is that if the United States was able to defeat an army supported by Moscow, the global balance can be shifted in favor of the West. The United Kingdom takes advantage of the Vietnam effect to support its remaining presence in the overseas territories, and to reaffirm that very special relationship with Washington, a very close bond. But a possible American victory in the United States would change the situation. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War is underway in the Middle East. And we know how it went. We know that Israel, after the initial confusion caused by the surprise of the concentric attack, quickly recovered and went on the offensive. Well, the American role in this case becomes even more decisive. The Arab states, observing the American ability to project power in Asia and the Soviet failure to effectively support the Vietnamese, find it less and less advantageous to buy weapons from Moscow and to have Moscow send them their military advisors. In fact, Saudi Arabia, which has always been pro-American anyway, is proposing more stable energy agreements to avoid excessive American interference. So, there is no famous oil crisis of '73. The oil-dollar connection becomes decisively stronger, laying the foundation for an even more solid United States economy. There are also repercussions in Latin America. Think about Allende's Chile. L invests more resources in Operation Condor. The 1973 coup occurs, this time with a clearer American presence. There's no need to hide behind Pinochet's face anymore. And the Soviet Union enters a crisis early, the same crisis that we saw in the 1980s. Afghanistan's quagmire is often called the Soviet Vietnam, Chernobyl. It all happens earlier, because with what was now considered overwhelming American superiority after the intervention in Afghanistan in '79, the Politburo became divided. An adventure in Central Asia could be devastating. The intervention is postponed, scaled down, and then abandoned. This outlook also changes the perception of the arms race in the 1980s without direct involvement in Afghanistan. The Soviet economy is still in crisis, but it's a longer crisis, more spread out over time. Why isn't there a need for overproduction? When Reagan, on the other hand, becomes president in the United States, his vision of peace through strength finds a country that is ready to support his approach. Military investments increase more rapidly with greater funding. Washington also tries to improve relations with hostile governments, especially in Central America. We think about Nicaragua in a different way compared to our historical approach. Vietnam, on the other hand, becomes a united Republican Vietnam, a complex process, a country that becomes a manufacturing hub similar to South Korea. That said, even in our timeline, Vietnam, unified by the North, has also become a manufacturing hub, but at a very low cost. Things are a bit different in our Ukraine. The Cold War doesn't end with the spectacular collapse of the Soviet Union on Christmas Day in 1991, but with a slow erosion of authority of the Soviet regime. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics lasts a bit longer, but is politically weaker. The Baltic republics and Ukraine sought their own autonomy in the 1980s, not in 1990-91, encouraged by the West. The dissolution, however, is inevitable. It will come a few years later, probably around 1994-95, in a more gradual way, and with fewer internal conflicts. So, in our alternate timeline, what could be the legacy of a Vietnam that was never lost? Uncontested United States hegemony for a longer time, strengthening of NATO, and an accelerated opening of China. Partially, and a Cold War that lasts a bit longer, but ends in a less traumatic way. Sure, it would be nice from a certain point of view if things had gone that way, or they would still be interesting developments, but that's not how it went. That's what alternate histories are for. I greet you, thank you once again for your attention, and I invite you to check out our upcoming content. If you want to suggest other alternate histories, or if you want to share your own alternate histories again, thinking that yes, this exercise was interesting, but something is still missing. Do you want me to discuss other topics? Write to me, and maybe next Christmas, we'll give you more gifts.